New fossils of tube-dwelling priapulid worms from the Devonian of Belgium have prompted a re-examination of the entire concept of Burgess Shale-type organisms and faunas. So what does the term Burgess Shale-type actually mean? Hello again, everyone. There I was, happily beavering away, trying to get together a talk on the Quanchuan Poo biota, when a new little paper popped up. This is one I'd kind of been expecting at some point, because I knew the specimens existed and that the authors were working on it, but I didn't know it was about to come out, so it was a bit of a nice surprise. Especially as the paper went into areas I didn't realise it was going to. So Mulvlu actually found this as well and pointed it out to me, but I was already looking at it. But yeah, I took another look and decided that, yes, this does need a video. It's actually quite an interesting story because it re-examines some pretty fundamental assumptions, beliefs, understandings of a large chunk of the early fossil record of animals. So let's have a look at it. It is based on some new specimens, just 2 specimens from the Wamy-Fontaine Lagerstätte, which is in southeastern Belgium in the early Devonian. I think that's the right pronunciation because it should be the French-speaking part, so something like Wamy-Fontaine. And this is from a quarry in which all of the really productive layers, I believe, are underwater. So it is basically material that's been collected from loose blocks. And these blocks have, in many cases, been weathered. And it is frustratingly difficult to get more material, even to see the exact context of the fossils. The site was discovered fairly recently. I've seen a few presentations at conferences about it. But there's been very little actually published yet. There was one paper recently on echinoderms, so Solutin and Stylophodon echinoderms, which are an interesting assemblage. There's very few of them again, but it adds to our knowledge of them. And there is a certain degree of exceptional preservation involved, certainly. The fossils are being studied mainly by Sebastian Olive and his colleagues, and in this particular paper the first author is Peter Van Rooij, who is an old friend of ours, and we tend to follow what he does because it's always interesting. Now, the fossils are pyritized, so they're replaced by iron pyrite, and it's a very similar age to the famous Hunsrück biota, the Hunsrück slate of Germany, where they are also pyritized fossils in black mudstones. Now in Hunsrück there is spectacular diversity and really good soft tissue preservation of a wide range of groups, and it is justifiably one of the most celebrated Paleozoic conservat Lagerstätten. It's a really, really important deposit. So when you start getting the same preservation in the same sort of mudstone at the same sort of age from just the other side of Luxembourg, really, it's tempting to start hoping for something really good. And at the moment we're limited, from what I understand, by the lack of good exposures and good preservation as a result of the lack of good exposures. So in Hunsrück, the Bundenbach quarry is enormous, and in the right layers, the fossils are exceptionally good and reasonably abundant. Here, we don't yet know. So there are definitely echinoderms, there are definitely all sorts of other bits and pieces. They mention in this paper that there are lots of indeterminate or uncertain fossils, which suggests that there's a lot more to come out if only they can get the right layers in outcrop and then quarry it. So that being said, it is a little limited in that way. It's also metamorphosed. Not enormously, it's sort of slaty, and there's been a lot of mineralogical changes going on since these fossils were formed. And that is also a little bit problematic because it tends to result in recrystallization, loss of detail, and so on. So they're working with limited material. And this paper is based on 2 specimens, one of them complete part and counterpart, one a partial part only. But they are consistent, they're showing the same thing, and it looks pretty convincing that this is indeed what they've got. They've identified it, and they're making the most of what they have. Okay. First thing to say is that despite the limited amount of material, this is a really thorough paper. This is what you expect from Peter Van Roy. His work is always very detailed and normally extremely solid. And this is no exception. There are long discussions, fully referenced, exhaustively referenced in terms of the interpretation of the organisms, how this group of tube worms have been classified, how they should be classified, what we know and what we don't. It's a really solid piece of work. And I'm not going to go into all of the details of that because it would take a lot of time. There will be other papers, I'm sure, when this sort of detail will become more relevant to what we're doing here. But I want to just go through a little bit about what the fossils are, how they're interpreted, and then, more importantly, this more general point that they're making about Burgess Shale-type organisms. So the fossils themselves are, let's face it, pretty dire. They are coarsely crystalline. They are mostly pyritized, but there's a lot more detail in terms of the preservation as well. But pyrite is basically what we're looking at here, and it is coarsely crystalline cubic pyrite, which is basically, it's grown within the soft tissues and within the tube. So we've got a fairly weakly visible outline of this slender tapering tube with a blunt narrow end, and then at the wide end you've got this consistently shaped soft-bodied organism sticking out from the end of the tube. Now, even at first glance to a paleontologist, you kind of know what this is because it's quite a distinctive outline. And the authors go through, in the supporting information, a lot of extra detail assessing the possibilities of it being any of the other possible groups of tube-dwelling organisms and ruling them out for one reason or another. But even at first glance, and then having the consistent shape of both of these, it's pretty convincing that this is indeed a thing called a selkirkiid. Now, selkirkiids are known almost exclusively from the Cambrian, particularly from the Burgess Shale and similar faunas. They were originally described from the Burgess Shale, from the genus Selkirkia, and there you have, of course, exquisite preservation of the soft tissues of these organisms, including this proboscis, the soft part sticking out from the end of the tube with little scalids on it. You can look at the detail of that and work out that it genuinely is a priapulid worm. So this is a well-known family from the Cambrian that is still alive today, but the preservation, at least, of these fossils decreases after the Cambrian. We don't have the same opportunities. Maybe they decrease in abundance, that's very likely as well. Maybe in diversity too, also very likely. But we don't see the fossils so much after the Cambrian. There are a handful of likely Ordovician ones and a few later on as well, but it's mostly a Cambrian fossil record of priapulids. Now, among priapulids, there is a tube-dwelling modern thing called Maccabeus, which is tiny and makes a tube out of bits of algal fragments and mucus, basically, sticks them together. That's very different to the tube of Selkirkia, which is secreted by the animal itself, by the worm, as a sort of hardened cuticular outer layer, which it is thought it then molted to separate itself from the tube, and then became mobile within this tube. But then when it wanted to grow further, it would shed the tube, shed its cuticle, grow, and start the whole process again. So it's quite a complex sort of a way of making a tube. And it seems to be something that was unique to these Cambrian selkirkiids. except that recently a selkirkiid was also found in the early Ordovician Fezwata biota of Morocco, and this again, it looks like a Cambrian leftover. It's a selkirkiid, tube-dwelling priapulid. But that was about it. It was thought to be one of these groups that disappears from the fossil record. And then we have this thing from the Devonian. Like I say, the preservation is diabolically bad at the same time as it's exceptionally good. That probably doesn't make any sense at all to most of you, but there are different levels of preservation. So what we have here is preservation of a soft-bodied animal with an organic tube, which should not fossilize under normal circumstances at all. So to see any preservation of this sort of thing is exceptionally good, because normally they all rot away and you're left with nothing. That said, within the spectrum of exceptional soft tissue preservation, the ranges from absolutely superb three-dimensional microscopic micron scale detail to something like this. And in this case, there is no micron scale detail. We're quite glad to see anything at all, but that's about the limit of what we've got. It's really quite coarse scale comparisons which are allowing us to say that this is a selkirkiid. I'm convinced it is. I totally agree that's what it is, but you can't see any of the fine detail that, for example, confirmed that selkirkiids were priapulids. That depends on things like the arrangement of scalids on the introvert. No, we're not going to be seeing that at all. Microstructure of the tube? No. There's a faint trace of transverse banding, which is on a larger scale than we see in other species. I'm not even convinced that's necessarily real, but the overall form of it and the form of the soft tissue is convincing. But you can't do much with it. And understandably, the authors have left this as Selkirkiasper. They're not trying to name a new species, even though, being from the Devonian, it almost certainly would be a different species to anything else described so far in the fossil record. So I have no doubt that it would be a new species. But you can't recognise it. If you had a decently preserved one, it might show features that are distinctive and diagnostic. But here, it's Selkirkiid, and we leave it at that. I will also say that this is probably the taphonomic detail they've done on this, the elemental mapping and the analysis of the mineral grains is really extraordinary. It's probably the most thorough that I've ever seen in a paper describing one of these fossils. And some of the detail that they go into is remarkable. So, for example, there is a reduction in the density of gallium and rubidium over the surface of the fossil compared with the matrix. But there is an increase in the amount of lead, which is believed to be impurities or things like galena, which are embedded in the pyrite crystals. And all of this makes perfect sense. It's just a really thorough job. Most of it doesn't tell us that much necessarily. It's coarsely crystalline pyrite, probably late-stage regrowth, I would guess, of some of it, rather than very early pyritization, which tends to be in the form of thamboids if it's growing in soft tissues, and then it tends to recrystallize later during sort of replacement fabrics. So it's a really thorough piece of work, this paper. You can see everything you want to see because it's all there, which is great. That's what we want. But the main value of the paper, in some ways, apart from just documenting its existence, is this discussion. So the selkirkiids have long been considered a Burgess Shale-type organism. This is one of those terms that we've always kind of known what it meant, but we have to go back a little bit to understand that exactly. When the Burgess Shale was discovered, it was early 1900s, and there were so many unique things. It was long before we understood what we were looking at even, and long before places like Chengjiang and all these other faunas were being discovered. And so you have this completely unique assemblage of fossils, all these weird arthropods, worms, sponges, everything that was turning up there pretty much was something new, which was therefore limited not only to the Cambrian but to the Burgess Shale itself. And then later on, in the 90s especially, we started finding more Burgess Shale-type faunas around the world from the Cambrian. And these also show a lot of similarity in these, in the fossils that they contain, these radiodonts and stuff like that. All these things that we just weren't seeing in any other deposits. They were Burgess Shale-type. So that has continued, and it's only recently, really since the early 2000s, that it started to become a little bit more questionable, and then a lot more questionable, because the assumption was that these Burgess Shale-type organisms were early experiments in the history of life that thrived in the Cambrian and then vanished. They went extinct. They disappeared from the fossil record and were replaced by sensible stuff that went on to survive into the modern. With the understanding that was developing in the 1970s onwards, that sort of changed a little bit, or was possibly even reinforced, because we started to recognize that these were not just weird experiments in the history of life, but they were deep branches. They were, when you trace the phyla, the major groups of animals backwards, these are where they join. They are the early members of the living groups, which are quite alien in comparison with the modern ones, but they make perfect sense when you can trace the structures back. So sometimes we even see things which appear to have characteristics of multiple phyla, and that is increasingly being recognized and understood, that there are quite a few things within the ecdysozoans, the spiralians, even deuterostomes, which have features that are probably in the stem group of 2 or more phyla. And again, this kind of fits with these being very early branching animals, which haven't yet evolved the final forms that we get to see later on. So again, it still makes sense to have this concept of Burgess Shale-type, and then they disappear because other things replace them. Life evolved to become more complex, better adapted to the ecosystems that we see later on. And the Ordovician, remember, after the Cambrian, was an extraordinary time of not just biodiversification on a massive scale, but also ecological transformation. There is a huge change in the structure of ecology. It gets much more complex, much more compartmentalized through the Ordovician. And yes, I will do a whole video on the Ordovician radiation because it's quite impressive. And that leads to the foundations of later marine life. So that makes sense. And then the Fezzuata turned up. And this is still being described. There are still many things that have not been published, but a lot of what has been published is important in many ways. And there are many leftovers from the Cambrian Burgess Shale-type faunas in the Ordovician, at least in the early Ordovician in the Fezzuata near the South Pole, which has been considered to be quite likely, or at least plausibly, a refugium. So this is where you get cold water and things surviving there, whereas they're displaced from the warm, shallow waters where most of evolution was going on rapidly. And this is a known phenomenon. We do get relics, evolutionary relics, things that have survived a long time, almost unchanged from an earlier state, in very deep and cold waters. So when these started turning up, it was a balance between, okay, does this mean that all of these Cambrian lineages just kept going much, much longer than we thought? Or were they just surviving in the South Polar region and sitting there for a while? Now, these weren't the first examples of these Burgess Shale-type things to turn up later. So there are morellomorphs, for example, these lace crabs, as they're called in the Cambrian. Weird and sort of spiky looking arthropods with gills everywhere, which have been found in even quite young and quite shallow water environments from Bohemia, for example. And then after freshwater, other things started turning up. So we had another very early Ordovician fauna called the Afan Gam biota in North Wales, which I've got a whole video about. But this also shows some Cambrian leftovers, including another radiodont, a herdiid, but much smaller than anything we've seen in the Cambrian. And then there was a priapulid worm again, not a well-preserved one, but it's got scalids. It's a decent priapulid worm. Leftover sponges, various other things that also suggest a lot of continuity, at least in the Tremadocian, the early Ordovician, with the Cambrian faunas. But that's still the early Ordovician. There are also things turning up since then, like the Llanfallteg biota, where you have Burgess Shale-type arthropods, by which we mean things that turn up in the Burgess Shale, or at least relatives of them, but do not later appear in the fossil record. And this is in the Middle Ordovician now. Castle Bank, we're starting to see things like opabiniids and other things as well turning up in the Middle Ordovician. And it seems that almost every new fauna that is being described from the Ordovician, and sometimes from later as well, Silurian, Devonian, is containing elements of these Cambrian Burgess Shale-type faunas. Which means that this whole concept of these Burgess Shale organisms having been somehow primitive and then going extinct because they got replaced by more derived and modern things appears to be completely false. This is particularly true because almost each group that turns up in a different new fauna is a different group. When you add all these together, it turns out to be many, many groups, lineages of Cambrian things that are typical of the Burgess Shale and other deposits are surviving into the Ordovician, and who knows how much later. So why has it taken us so long to realise this? Well, the obvious thing is that we don't have the preservation. The Cambrian is unique in many ways, but especially in having spectacular preservation of the Burgess Shale-type faunas. So these are a suite of deposits where we get beautiful soft tissue preservation as flattened films of carbon, plus or minus pyrite, plus or minus other bits, which often preserve extreme detail, so internal organs and so on, of not just crunchy things, but entirely soft-bodied animals in the best cases. And we lose those after the Cambrian. It was thought we lost them entirely. Then freshwater turned up, then Afan Gam, then Castle Bank, then a few others like Liaoxi in China also has a few elements like this. And it looks like this window is what we've been missing. So the preservational window largely, but not entirely closed around the early Ordovician, and particularly around the late Middle Cambrian. The late Cambrian is not exactly a desert, but we don't have that much in the way of good fossil preservation in the late Cambrian. It looks like there's a dip in diversity, but that's probably just that we don't have, for whatever reason, maybe largely random chance, maybe geochemical changes in the ocean, we don't have good fossils for large chunks of it. There are a lot of barren rocks in the late Cambrian. And it's also probably true it hasn't been that extensively studied because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, that when we think that this interval doesn't have that much in the way of exceptional preservation, we stop looking for exceptional preservation. We go somewhere where we're more likely to find it. And that is changing. I mean, there are a few deposits now which have elements of it, but we're yet to find anything as spectacular as something like the Burgess Shale, even though we do have bits like the Orston, which are these microscopic 3D phosphatized things, which are incredible in their own way as well. But they're limited. So the window for the Burgess Shale-type faunas disappears. and then reopens occasionally later on. So if we had the same record in the Ordovician as we do in the Cambrian, would we actually see that all of these Burgess Shale-type organisms just carried on? And if so, for how long? Because it's true that they're generally not here now. You could argue something like Rhabdoplurans are a holdover from the Cambrian, but in general, all of these weird groups are basically lost. So how did those early groups, these stem groups of classes and phyla and groups of phyla, how did they go extinct and when? How long did they cling on for? And was it even clinging on? Because it's one thing that's really important to realise about the fossil record is that if you're finding anything in it, it was successful, because the chances of anything which was just one or two individuals just about managing to survive, making it into the fossil record, are so slim that they basically might as well not exist. So if we're seeing something, it was actually doing quite well. It was surviving well enough to have a decent population that we can see as fossils. So all these things like the selkirkiids, which survived apparently until the Devonian with no problem. The opobiniids in the Ordovician, the vadiodonts, which seem to have been all over through the Ordovician. All of these things were not just clinging on. They were integrated into these ecosystems. They were thoroughly living as part of them and being successful within them. Which kind of changes our view of both Cambrian faunas and later faunas, because there's often been a perception that these Cambrian biotas, the Burgess Shale-type faunas, are full of little experiments that weren't actually all that good when you get down to it. That they were a bit experimental and, evolution hadn't quite got its act sorted yet. But that is not what this is showing us. When you see this pattern of them all surviving alongside much more diversified and more complex Ordovician ecosystems, it shows that they were thoroughly adapted to the world in which they lived. And that, of course, is the case in evolution generally. If we see something in the fossil record, it was something which was adapted to the ecosystems of the time. It wasn't in some way primitive. That's a word that has a very specific meaning. You can refer to primitive characters, which means that ones that were present very much earlier in the evolutionary history. So a primitive character versus a derived character. It has no connotations of superiority or inferiority. It just means that it was an early character. And we need to get away from this whole concept of the Cambrian faunas or the Ediacaran faunas or anything else being some sort of primitive thing in the sense of not being up to it, because they were completely well adapted to the time in which they thrived. That's what evolution does. It just gives things the solutions that they need and which appear by random chance in their genomes to be able to colonize and take over and so on. And that's evolution for you. So the Cambrian we have to stop seeing as primitive. We have to start seeing it not as a sort of precursor fauna which was incomplete, and more as an evolutionary stage in which it might have been much more complex than we might initially think of it. It also means that these Ordovician faunas that we're looking at, where they get much more diversified, are not superior in any way. They haven't excluded the Cambrian organisms because the Cambrian ones become a part of it. They are just simply a stage in the evolution of life and ecology where you have all these diversifying brachiopods, bryozoans, crinoids, all these familiar things for anyone who's collected fossils at this time. All of those things that were diversifying in the Ordovician were not pushing out the Cambrian things. They were living alongside them. Everything was intermeshing in a way that led to a stable, complex ecosystem. So what it comes down to then is, what do we mean by Burgess Shale-type? Does the term actually mean anything at all? Is it just because we found the Burgess Shale before we had any understanding of the rest of it, and therefore we've just let it stick? Well, the thing is, the term Burgess Shale-type normally prefixes one of three things. You have Burgess Shale-type organisms. This is what Peter Van Roy et al. Are arguing, I think very convincingly, is basically a nonsensical term, that we need to just drop it completely. Because the idea that you have a fauna which was around in this environment, in this time only, the Burgess Shale-type communities, but the organisms within them are somehow limited or purely representative of these Burgess Shale-type faunas, it doesn't make any sense anymore, because they carried on regardless. They were just the organisms of the time, the animals that were living at that particular interval. So I totally agree. It's time we dropped the whole concept of Burgess Shale-type organisms, because, yeah, it doesn't mean anything. You can certainly compare individual species that turn up in the Ordovician, Silurian, whenever, to things that occur in the Burgess Shale, but to put that into this sort of box that we have of Burgess Shale-type organisms keeps sort of promulgating this idea that there was something really different about these organisms, whereas they were just part of the spectrum. So yeah, stop using that. Doesn't make any sense. On the other hand, we also have Burgess Shale-type preservation. Now, this also is part of a spectrum. So the classic Burgess Shale-type preservation is what we see in the Burgess Shale, which is graphitic carbon films, often with clay minerals, but that's secondary, sometimes with bits of pyrite or other minerals involved as well. But it's mainly carbon film preservation in mudstone of soft-bodied or sclerotized organisms just flattened onto bedding planes. And in some cases, you can sort of dissect off the layers of the carapace and the cuticle and the internal organs and so on. And it's an extraordinary type of preservation, which is abundant in the Cambrian. We are now seeing that the same or very similar preservation turns up in the Ordovician in various places. And so far, that's about it. You could possibly argue that carbon film preservation of soft tissues also reappears in the Jurassic, because there we have various deposits where you have ichthyosaurs with skin impressions. So stuff like places like Holtzmaden and the Oxford clay of the UK, where we have exceptional preservation, articulated skeletons, and the shadow of the soft tissue. And that is basically films of carbon in a mudstone. So technically, that probably counts as Burgess Shale-type preservation. They're not reflective films, but then most of the Ordovician ones aren't either. And I think that reflective film is a bit of a sort of misdirection, because it's related to metamorphism. The Burgess Shale has been heated to about greenschist facies, which is high up the metamorphic sequence, but was protected by being right next to a massive carbonate platform, escarpment. So you got a pressure shadow, but you still had the same heating. And so you end up with these, what would have been originally probably black fossils, being graphitized, turned into effectively graphite sheets. And that's why they've become so reflective. In Castlebank, for example, we see a combination of the two. We see tough carbonaceous remains are quite often silvery, and then the softer bits are mostly black. So there is a spectrum here between black and silver. Pyritization is often a part of it. So in Chengjiang, there's significant pyrite. In the Fezwata biota, there's a lot of pyrite. There's a whole spectrum in the amount of soft tissue detail, labile tissue preservation that we see. There's a whole spectrum in all sorts of other things, where you get phosphate preservation inside the gut, for example, of these things. And in general, I think it's fair to say that Burgess Shale-type preservation is a spectrum, but it is also kind of recognizable. It's distinct probably from the pure pyritization that we see in places like Beecher's trilobite bed, the Hunsrück slate, and Warmefontein. So there are various sites where we see more pyrite and less carbon, and they're probably end members of a bigger spectrum. But we're trying to take a whole range of different preservational styles, chop them up into little bits that we can label and stick them into boxes. Whereas the reality, of course, is that there are chemical processes that overlap in the environments that they form in, and so we end up with trying to break up a spectrum into separate blocks. But the carbon film end of this spectrum, I think it's fair to say, is Burgess Shale-type preservation, and that term is probably still absolutely valid. Okay, so we're left then with Burgess Shale-type faunas. What does that mean? Because a fauna is an assemblage of animals. A biota, an assemblage of animals and plants or other organisms. So a biota is just a more general term. They should be technically biotas if you've got algae in them. So a Burgess Shale-type biota is a combination of organisms. This is something which is not referring to the preservation, it's referring to the assemblage of organisms. And in the Cambrian, it is true that we see this very consistent pattern, as I've mentioned several times in previous videos, of the major groups that dominate in a particular sort of very broad offshore muddy shelf environment. But we see the same pattern of the organisms almost invariably including things like radiodonts, priapulids, wiwaxiids, paleoscalecids, coid sponges, leptomytids. There's all sorts of groups that you can put on a checklist and say, well, you're going to get all those. And that is recognizably a Burgess Shale-type fauna. But that is kind of its age. So when we're talking about an Ordovician one, let's take the Fezzuata. Is that a Burgess Shale-type biota? It has a lot of elements that are typical of the Cambrian Burgess Shale-type faunas. But it also has a lot more things that are typical of the Ordovician. And it's clearly a sort of hybrid community, if you like. It's got elements of the more derived groups and the more Cambrian groups all living together alongside each other. Does the presence of these Cambrian leftovers make it by definition a Burgess Shale-type fauna? Yeah, not sure. What about Castlebank? There we have, in many ways, a typical Ordovician fauna. It's got all of the sort of things you'd expect for the middle of the Ordovician radiation, and then it's got things like priapulids. We've also got a little selkirkiid-like thing. It's got opabiniids. It's got various arthropods that look very like Cambrian ones. Some of them are not like Cambrian ones. Some of them probably are. There's actually a lot more diversity in arthropods, but mostly it is Ordovician diversification of arthropods, but with some leftover Cambrian sponges, panarthropods, worms, and so on, and many other more modern groups turning up as well. So on balance for that, the Burgess Shale leftovers are a very tiny proportion of the entire biota, which means you can't possibly call it a Burgess Shale-type fauna. Can you? Because it's Burgess Shale-type preservation, and it includes some Burgess Shale-type elements. This is where there is a debate to be had. Does the term Burgess Shale-type fauna or biota actually have any meaning? And my feeling is that it does for the Cambrian, and after that, it's a very grey area. It's a spectrum again. And we actually used that term when we published Castlebank. But ideas are shifting, and our ideas are shifting. And probably it's not really an effective term outside the Cambrian. And by definition in the Cambrian, because of the continuity of these faunas, the similarities of them, anything that lives in that sort of environment and has Burgess Shale-type preservation is going to be a Burgess Shale-type fauna. That's just what you get. So in the Ordovician and in later rocks especially, it's not going to be what you get. Maybe it's going to be a Castle Bank-like fauna. Don't know. But there comes a point when having a box to put things in is actually detrimental to understanding. And this is a major problem in science generally, I think, that we like to label things, but then the labels take on a life of their own. So we then have a whole picture in our mind about what that label means. It colours what you think of it. What we need when we're discussing any new conservat Lagerstätte is description and comparison rather than labels. I reckon. I think that probably will just about do it. It's already been quite a lot of nattering, and I know I just got carried away for about 40 minutes in one take, which is quite unusual for me. There will be breaks, I'll cut out some bits of umming and ahhing. But yeah, that's one take without any script or anything like that, just because it's such an interesting subject and you can just get your teeth into it so easily. And anyone who works in these faunas will have their own opinion, and there will be different perceptions of the value of the term Burgess Shale-type in different contexts. But I think the authors here are absolutely right that the idea of a Burgess Shale-type organism is misguided. It doesn't actually have any usefulness anymore, and it is actually detrimental. Burgess Shale-type preservation, I think, is absolutely fine, and Burgess Shale-type faunas, biotas, nah, less so. Anyway, what do you think? Do we need to find a different way of classifying, categorizing, naming all these things? Or do we just want to get away from these labels entirely and just talk about them in detail instead? Too many sound bites in paleontology. Let's actually get some proper detail back into it. That's what I say. As you probably gathered by now, if you're still here. Bye for now.